Okay. Hi, I'm Gretchen Sable, and I'm president of League of Women Voters ABC, serving Anoka County plus the cities of Dayton and Champlin in northern Hennepin County. League of Women Voters ABC is a grassroots organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. And we also work to influence public policy through education and advocacy. LWV ABC, like all League of Women Voters, advocates on issues but doesn't support or oppose any candidate or political party. We are a political organization, but nonpartisan all the way. So with that said, I'm very happy to welcome today our guest speakers, Senator Dave Durenberger and Lori Sturdevant, from former writer with Star Tribune. And they're going to tell us about their book that they wrote before the pandemic, which was like so long ago. So anyhow, the book is called When Republicans Were Progressives, and I will just let them take it away. You got the book there to show us?
I've got it here to show you. Here it is.
Yeah, there you go.
All right.
Okay, take it away.
Thank you, Gretchen. It is really special for us to be here with you, partly because it's been such a long time that Dave and I did one of these book talks. Senator Durenberger and I were quite a road show in the spring and summer of 2019. Our book came out in the late 2018 period. And we were really pleased with the reception the book got, and with people's sense that something was not quite right in our politics, and that perhaps there's something we can learn from looking back that might be helpful as a guide going forward. Well, then along came the pandemic, and all these sorts of things ground to a halt, including because of some health problems that I had, ground to a halt with regard to virtual sessions as well. So now this is our first time together doing this in quite a while. Dave, how are you?
Well, I'm doing fine, thank you, for an 86-year-old going on 100. And I say that almost with tongue in cheek, but I have I've been in and out of hospitals or doctor's offices a lot in the last 2 years, including I have a brand new hip on my right side, and well, you don't need to know all the details.
No.
But feeling great. The move we made from a rather large house in Crocus Hill with a garden that we loved it and hated to leave,
It's beautiful,
to this end of Summit Avenue with the look at the cathedral and the Capitol, and you know, all the nice people that pass by here, and so many of them are walking, which is a great deal, even in the weather. So, but otherwise, I feel fine. And my wife Susan is. And I have enjoyed a great deal the opportunities that this period of time has given us to, you know, sort of relax one part of our mind and pick up another one. And the other one is, will it ever end? Or, you know, when are things going to get better? But for me, and I think we'll talk about it as we go through this. It's been a particular pleasure to spend time, as we both have, during the time we spent talking about the book, with mayors and city council members and the folks in what we call communities all over Minnesota, geographic communities. And it's been an eye-opener, a heart pleaser. It's really been an absolute delight. And so if there was a downside to what we've all been through, that's the upside, you know, discovering where part of the future lies.
Well, don't lose that thought, because we'll want to talk more about that as we talk a little more about where we've been and where we go from here. Where do you see hope? I think you and I have some things to say about the strength of local government and the strength of citizenship still in Minnesota. But I used to always sort of wonder what Dave was going to say when I would ask him these questions. Today, I wonder that just a little more than usual. But let's try to go through our paces here, Dave, Senator. Tell these folks how this book came to be. It was a long time in the gestation.
Yeah, I've written 2 or 3 or 4 books of one kind or another, most of them related to the role of government. I mean, my first one was on national defense policy, and the second one was a little broader than that, but it encompassed a lot of the speeches that I'd given while I was in the United States Senate, which reflected the changes that were taking place in the role that the Congress was playing and the president was playing in national affairs. So that was sort of like going to be my book life, I guess, until you came and said, how about, I think you said, somebody told me that you have set a record for the number of boxes of your material at the Minnesota History Center, like 400 and some boxes of your stuff. And you may not have known it at the time, but I did when you said that the man who was the chief curator loved the work, because he said, I could tell from all of this stuff exactly how you thought.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly how you thought.
Well, because you cared about policy and it showed in your records. But
Yeah.
I'm not the one who got you going on this book. Russ Fridley is, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. Yeah.
The Historical Society longtime head Russell Fridley had a strong view that Minnesota's the particular Minnesota Republican Party, a distinctive party, distinctive from the national one, was a significant shaper of the modern Minnesota and deserved to have its story told. And who else better to tell it but someone who had sort of been there almost from the beginning. You were 4 years old when Harold Stassen was elected, but the Harold Stassen years forward is the arc that Russell Fridley wanted you to tell him. And you said to me, you were interested in telling that. I said, I am too. I'm interested in that very same story. So, but the title of our book, When Republicans Were Progressive, often provokes a question from folks. What, progressive? Huh? What do you mean by progressive? Tell us, what did you mean by progressive?
Yeah, it's, and I'm going to try to keep this very brief, because I learned what it meant when my law partner, Harold Levander, decided he's going to run for governor. And he was elected, and he called me up right away and said, Dave, I want you to be my, what they call executive secretary, which meant that I was going to spend 4 years as his chief of staff. What I didn't realize when that happened was that Minnesota was in the middle of the 1960s, was a national leader in trying to shape what should be the role of government as communities changed rapidly during that period of time. And we were blessed by decisions taken way back in 1913 that the Senate for one would be called conservatives, and
Nonpartisan, yes.
Rather than, yeah, that sort of thing. And so there never was an unconservative Minnesota Senate. And among the unconservatives was Gordon Rosenmeyer from Little Falls, whose father had been a congressman and who was dedicated to the work of the role of legislation, of law, of government in the lives of people. And Gordon had the gift of sensing change. And he could predict what was happening and what was coming in his general way, but he made the state and the people in the state who were in state government focus on anticipating this change. Yes. And so by the time Levander succeeded Karl Robach, whom he had defeated in the election, the stage was set. We had a state planning agency that was about a year old. And that state planning agency was looking over this rapid change that was taking place in all these townships in Anoka County and in Dakota County, and, all around the Hennepin, Ramsey, Washington County, so forth. And they're just watching these townships all try to convert to becoming cities. And so Rosenmeyer says we're going to have to make sense of this, and the sense of the transition. And the state planning agency, Ray Olson, who'd been the administrator out in Burnsville or in Bloomington when they tried to take over Burnsville, that far back, was responsible for it. But that's the environment in which we landed.
Yes.
In that environment were Republicans in particular, but Democrats also, who saw the value of doing just this, anticipate change. They were both involved with the Citizens League, for example.
Yeah, well,
Thinking about them-
before you go too far down that pike, though, let me get in a little history note. One of the reasons I liked the title of our book, When Republicans Were Progressive, is that it harkens back to something older in the Republican Party, the progressive movement that was spearheaded by Theodore Roosevelt 125 years ago. Was very much, that was really the first regular use of that term progressive, and it spoke to using government as a tool to solve the people's problems, not necessarily businesses' problems, though they would be solved as well. But prior to that, the attitude of government was much more laissez-faire, much more hands-off, help keep the business economy strong, but otherwise let the people deal with their own issues. That was not the attitude of the progressives. The progressives were willing to use government to work on issues that were more of a societal nature. Minnesota bought into that in a big way. When Theodore Roosevelt ran for president as a bull mooser under the Progressive Party ticket in 1912, he carried 6 states. Minnesota was one of them. And then when Harold Stassen comes along in 1938 and remakes the Republican Party, it was very much with the ideas that Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party of a generation earlier had espoused. So this, I think the word progressive, which now we associate with the far left in the Democratic Party, really has its roots in the Republican Party that you represented. And of course, as someone who came into the state political scene through the Harold Levander law firm, you speak right to that Stassen pedigree. Because what is that law firm? Was founded by Harold Stassen, is that right? And then Harold Levander comes along and you go to work for that law firm before you go to work in the governor's office, right?
You got it.
Okay, so that and then there's one other figure from that period that I think we should talk about before we go too far with the 1960s and 70s, and that's the importance of Elmer L. Anderson. Important to both you and me personally. We were both close to him, but he represented a sort of a flowering in some ways of some of those progressive ideas. What would you say about that?
Just start by saying this, that traditionally the Republicans were pretty conservative. And that was because the business leaders in the Republican Party in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and so forth were themselves conservative. Elmer Anderson came on the scene as the new president of a little company called H.B. Fuller, and which he had bought from its founder after Elmer moved from and Eleanor moved from Chicago. And not only did he buy the company and the responsibility, he decided he would run for the legislature. There was an opening in his district. He ran against an incumbent who was one of these conservative kind of guys who'd been there forever. And Elmer won, and he got a seat in the Minnesota State Senate as he was doing all these other things. And Elmer was the person who didn't seek power. He sought opportunity, which is the way I put it, I know, to both of us. And he had a hard time with people that didn't think that way. Look for the opportunity you're given by your office to do this variety of things. But what he became was a man who wouldn't go away and on the conservative part of the Republican Party. And he brought with him to the opportunity to run for higher office, which he did, and was elected in 1960, as I recall, when he was originally elected, and then unelected unfortunately, and we won't have to detail this, but because it's history, but sad history, unelected by Karl Rolvag in 1962. But
91 votes, still the closest gubernatorial election in U.S. history.
Is it really?
Still is, yes, 91 votes in a 4-month recount.
Yeah.
But Elmer Anderson embraced civil rights and was a champion both in the legislature and the governor's office for some nation-leading civil rights bills. He was a strong conservationist and strong for serving the whole state, big pusher for what was called the Taconite Amendment, which helped revive the then flagging iron ore industry on the Iron Range. but was also a strong environmentalist, created some state parks, worked hard on what he was then called conservation, and we would now call environmentalism, was his long suit. Things that were not so much, that were then associated with the Republican Party, things that are less associated with the Republican Party today. But then in the Levander years, again, plenty of new ground was broken on a bunch of issues, tax policy and otherwise. Tell us a little bit about what that period we called the heyday of Minnesota progressive republicanism during the Levander years.
Yeah, the best way to tell it is when Levander got elected and the legislative leaders went down to South St. Paul to his home saying, okay, Governor, what do you want us to do? And he said, pass the party platform.
Mm-hmm.
Pass the party platform. And that platform to this day, particularly as it relates to what is the role of government, what should the role of government be? How do we look at it as a local entity, as a state entity, as our responsibility should be? And that is what they proceeded to do, because they had a majority of the vote and they had support from a lot of outside people, the Citizens League and a variety of things like that. And they proceeded to pass the party platform into law. The one thing that Levander did not support, because he had made a campaign promise, was a sales tax. Mm-hmm. And for that, too often, he, and that time is remembered, that he swore he was going to veto the sales tax, on the day before the election. He didn't want to lose. And so he felt he was stuck with that. And they eventually passed it with 2 votes. But the most important part of that, Laurie, as that relates to the role of progressive, is that the stage was set for everything that Minnesota was doing and was going to have to do more of in terms of the relationship between government and community organizations and how change was going to impact on public policy in the area of education, yes, in the area of healthcare. You can go on, conservation, you can go on and on with this list. It was an incredible period of time, succeeded by another one when Wendy Anderson was elected. But the same people were playing again in mm-hmm. that legislative game in that time, which says something about where we were in Minnesota when it came to the purpose of being a state legislator.
Yeah. When I was first at the Capitol, it was said to me that the purpose of state government is to set the table for the prosperity of the next generation. Those people in those years really took that to heart, really believed that. Hence, you have the Metropolitan Council as the big planning component, and the creation of the State Planning Agency, which does no longer exist, but was doing very good work for a long time before it went the way of budget cuts in the plenty years. I think it actually got killed twice. Was revived by Arnie Carlson and then killed by during the Tim Pawlenty years. The expansion of state universities happened during that time. The expansion of state parks, all things to get ready for a larger Minnesota, a more urban Minnesota. And of course, it helped that we finally started doing redistricting the way the federal courts, the federal rules required. That finally started happening in the 1960s. And it meant that the metropolitan area finally got its due at the legislature as well. Mm-hmm. Well, you then leave the Capitol when Harold Levander decides not to run again in 1970, and you have a few years of focusing on other things. But in 1978, you decide to run for the US Senate. And in those intervening 8 years between 1970 and 78, we had Watergate. We had the largest DFL majorities then from at any point in the Minnesota legislature in those post-Watergate years. We had a Republican Party that seemed to be really on the ropes, but along came 1978. Wendell Anderson's self-appointment to the US Senate was an issue. The economy was an issue. And things began, and there was an attitude in the Republican Party about expanding the reach to the voters. Talk a little bit about that independent Republican Party.
Yeah, I think the idea of the independent Republican Party was to establish a distinction that from what was going on in Washington, basically, and what people were reading about and deploring in that period of time. When I eventually was elected, I wanted to be a governor, so I filed for governor, and that lasted until Al Quie decided he wanted to come back from Washington and be a governor, and so the powers that be decided Al Quie should be the governor. And if I wanted to run for something else, why didn't I think about running for the Senate? Well, I had never thought about it, but I immediately turned my attention to it, and I think what was going on in both at the national level and in Minnesota at that time was it started in 1976 and 78 and 80 was a I don't want to use the word throw the rascals out, but I think that's the best way to put it in change of leadership was really important. And as I reflect now, and without getting into it at all, the class of 1976 senators, class of 1978, which I was in, the class of 1980, were all change agents. They were from the more moderate side to the more conservative side, depending on the constituencies that elected them. But they were all dedicated to the same, basically to the same cause. So that when Ronald Reagan came along and was elected, we were a moderating, if you will, influence, because by then we were in the majority. We were a moderating influence on what may have been Reagan's instincts about what should the role of government be.
Well, I remember you saying that you think Reagan was not nearly as conservative as some of the people who idolize him today believe he was. But you talk about the arc of your Senate career. You served 16 years in the U.S. Senate, which in Minnesota history for a Republican is a long time. And you were part, and you were part of that group when you first came, as you just described, this group of moderating Senate Republican voices, maybe about 17, 18 of you, who would pull toward the center and be the deal makers on a lot of things. But in that 16-year arc, your numbers dwindle, and tell us about that experience. What was that like?
Yeah, and I'll keep this really, really brief, but because it's the realities of the influence of the Newt Gingrich gang, I'll call them, became Dick Cheney, included, other people like that, who saw the permanence, it seemed, of the Democrats owning the House of Representatives as getting in the way of the talent that Newt and those people thought they would bring to the table. So what evolved during that period of time was an image that Ronald Reagan was terribly conservative and we had to pull him down and all that sort of thing. That wasn't really true. My favorite observation, and I know it's in the book, is what Senate leaders like Howard Baker and Bob Dole would tell you to this day. Dole is the only one of the two that, God bless him, is still alive. But they would tell you that when they couldn't get the votes to pass something that President Reagan wanted, he would say, "Hey, that's not so bad. Don't sweat it. It's we're batting 71% right now. That's not half bad." He had this positive attitude toward what he was engaged in, rather than what some people characterize as an overly principled engagement. And I'd like to tell people that his chief of staff was Jim Baker, and his vice president was George Bush. And why would a guy, who was so-called ultra-conservative or something like that, appoint those two people? These Republicans in this period of time, and all the ones that I worked with, and I still talk to, from the most conservative like Gordon Humphrey up in New Hampshire, to the more moderates like myself, like Jack Danforth and down in Missouri and people like that. We all were of one mind about our role, that we and the president were given the responsibility to do what America had needed to do in that period of time, both on the domestic side, which included a lot of tax reform, environmental reform, a lot of things like that, and on the international side, which was just as important.
Well, and the frustrations you had on what was sort of your signature issue, the healthcare issue, the frustrations you had by the Clinton years, by the 1993, 1994 period, spoke volumes about the difficulty that you began to have as a moderate or progressive Republican. Say a little bit about that, please.
Yes, the challenge to thinking big, if you will, about issues was not so much partisanship as it was where you came from in America, because we now know so very well we're a variety of states, and some are more conservative or whatever you want to call them than others. Some are more liberal, but in those days, both conservative and liberal thought of themselves as progressive in the sense that their job was to get something done. They weren't sent to Washington to do nothing and to just vote against things. They were to participate in a process that would balance this interest that exists in 50 states in America in the decisions that the United States Senate and the House had to take. And there's story after story in this book, I think, about the role that George Mitchell, one of my best buddies in the Senate, played after the Democrats took over the majority from the Republicans in the Senate in 1977. And George Mitchell saw his job. He saw the House being much more liberal than the Senate. So he saw that his job was to get legislation out of that body from the Republicans and Democrats, take it to the House in the shape that we could bring it back to the Senate and get a Republican president, whether it was Reagan or it was his successor, Bush 41, to sign it. And I could, we don't have time tonight, but the book will tell you, some of the surprises of what we were able to accomplish in that period of time, because George Mitchell, as the Democratic leader, saw it as a responsibility to bring the Republican president to the same table that Democrats and Republicans in the Senate were at.
He was not interested in defining his role as an obstructionist.
No.
But that begins to change, as you mentioned, Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. And that's, of course, when you began to have real trouble crafting the kind of compromises that you had become accustomed to crafting with healthcare.
Yep, and it's it's obvious. It's even obvious today, I think, that the challenge, what Bob Dole just expressed it in a little tiny little piece. Everybody expects Bob to die any day, because his cancer is really, he's had it for a long time. But right now it's pretty serious. But he wrote a little piece in the Wall Street Journal last week, I think it was. But the point he made well in that piece was simply that the problem today is that everyone's voting the next election. And the whole focus is on how you get re-elected. How do you get your party? And that he didn't have to explain what he meant. Any of us who watched this process, including all of you who are active in the League of Women Voters, know what he was talking about. Every vote is pointed at the next election.
Yep.
And that was not the case. Yes, of course, everybody would like to come back. Everybody would like to see these same people again, and they would like to discuss these same issues again, of course. But this is the big difference, I think, between now and then, and Bob has pointed that out very succinctly.
Yeah, I remember in some of our previous engagements, I used to say that one of the big changes in the time I covered politics is that politics was routinely seen as a means to an end, the end being good governance in the, say, first 30 years of my 40 years at the Star Tribune, but by the last 10 years or so, politics was seen as an end in itself. And good governance, well, that was maybe an afterthought for a lot of the folks we were electing. It was they would lament, they would regret that that was true, but that was the emphasis within their caucuses, and they felt obliged, mostly because of campaign finance imperatives, obliged to go along with this focus on elections first and governance second. Well, I wanted to ask you to then succinctly describe what happened to all you progressive Republicans. You leave the Senate at the end of 1994. That's been a while ago. What's happened in the last 25 years to the folks who thought the way you did? Have they disappeared completely? Have they become Democrats? Or independents? Where are they?
Well, I know one thing because I called a whole lot of them on behalf of Project Lincoln. Practically all of them, with one exception, who happens to be a local senator. They were going to vote for Joe Biden ahead of time, and I presume they did vote for Joe Biden. And I think the reason they did is they knew him. He was in the United States Senate. They knew what kind of person he was. They knew that regardless of Democrat or Republican, he was going to be better than what we had, what the Republicans had been able to do up to that point. The unanimity that those who served at the time I served about what's been going on since then, about their feelings about it, about the effect, it blurs the totally distinction between what was the far right and the far left, if you want to call it that, in politics, which obviously exists because that's what the constituents are. But it's all blurred now when it comes to any of us who have served in that period of time. As long as we got some breath in us, like Bob Dole does, any of us would do anything we could to get the clock turned back, or in some way persuade the American people that they've been led down by that infamous Supreme Court decision. What is it? The name of that decision? Anyway, the one that says that everybody gets to spend as much money as they want on buying.
Citizens United.
Yeah, Citizens United. I mean,
which
the
is
worst thing that's happened to this country. It's just, now it all kind of like ties together. And one of the reasons why it's so important that people like members of the League of Women Voters, focus on the things that they can see and experience every day and influence every year at the local level, because this is going to it ain't going to start, it's not going to start. Change is not going to start at the top. It's going to have to start at the bottom and work its way up. And it's going to have to be in state legislatures and in governor's offices. And that's what's going to happen.
Well, funny you should mention legislatures, because today we've started the special session that's supposed to we're picking up where we left off in a regular session that was inconclusive a month ago. We're struggling with gridlock, and have been struggling with gridlock in Minnesota for 30 years, because we've had divided government with one term exception for 32 years now. And so we're struggling here. And you spoke earlier about you look to the quality of our mayors and our local governments for hope. And you and I have talked over the last year and a half, 2 years, about the quality of citizenship we still see in Minnesota, which is pretty impressive. What advice do you have for these citizens who want to make their politics more effective, to get back to more effective government that serves the people better?
Look for leaders. Look for people that you consider the folks that can do that sort of thing. Right now, most of them are sitting in mayor's chairs or city council chairs or things like that. And there's the places that you go that people have to run for election, but they have to serve a broader than just Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, whatever it is, purpose. And they have to find ways to influence the governor. They have to find ways to influence the state legislature. They would like to say to these guys in St. Paul, get off your fat butts, pardon me, or, you know, put your pocketbook away and start thinking about the folks that you represent, not just the folks that are going to elect you, but the folks you represent, who are the people of Minnesota. That was what made the Rogoshevskis, that's a whole list we can talk about in Minnesota history of people who made this the state that has this reputation, were people that ran for office for that purpose, found others just like them when they got there, and together they brought us what we needed in the new role for government. Right now, those people are in mayor's offices, in large part, county commissioners, city councils, and I think we both know some of them, and we're getting to know them even better from time to time since we wrote that book. Somebody thinks that somehow or other maybe we know how this works, but I'll tell you, that's the future. It's not at the level where the next election is the purpose of going to the state House or the Senate in Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those remarks, Dave, and I'm glad to see some questions starting to populate the chat here. That's going to help us out. I'd just like to say that I take heart and see hope in the continued vitality of the League of Women Voters and of organizations like this. In some parts of the country, our civic institutions have atrophied and are really no longer available for those citizens who want to get something going by way of change. In many parts of the country, people have to start from scratch. That's not true in Minnesota. We do still have some vital civic institutions, maybe not as strong as they once were. We had a heyday of that kind of thing in the mid 20th century, and many of those institutions are weaker than they were, but they're still around. And they're there to be used. And I know that there's an opportunity through the League of Women Voters for people to understand how our system works on a deeper level, to see opportunities for reform that might really be meaningful, that might actually make a difference rather than to cause more problems. So thank you to the League for your staying power through now more than 100 years. And I'm hopeful that you can continue to be a force for some positive change in Minnesota. Maybe we should turn now, Dave, to some of the questions that are in the chat. And Gretchen, can you help us? Have you picked out a good one for us to get us going?
We could start with a quick one. Do you see political party realignment? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, do you see political party realignment happening in the near future? That's from Jean Merriam.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. I think I don't want to try to identify a near future, but it's not yet on the horizon. Let me just put it that way. I think the effort to do something about the influence of money up and down the scale and elections, needs to be dealt with. And this is my great hope for a Biden administration, that after we get through the first year, or just getting through the first year, that administration is a challenge. But when we get through that part of it, you're going to see a different tone about the role of government, and you may even see that the influence that it will have on those who are in positions in the state, at the state level. It gives you, everybody in the either party, Gene, as you know only so well, needs the encouragement before they even run for office of knowing that they can get something done, that there is a place for them, that there's an opportunity for them and their constituents. As the League knows only so well, because you've always been the people who have that kind of neutral, nonpartisan influence on people. But the sense is, I won't run for office unless I know I can do something. I'm not running just to get reelected. And so those are the people you have to seek out, and those are the commitments you have to get in advance from people. That and do it. Support the ones that Jane, already are going to deliver regardless of the politics.
Now, Senator Merriam, though, I think that by realignment, you may mean the creation of a third party. And Minnesota history suggests that in Minnesota, that's possible. We've had third parties, and we've had some with some considerable success at the state level. But the thing that I think would spur the creation of third parties more than anything else is ranked choice voting. And that's why one of the reasons I've been kind of an advocate for ranked choice voting through these last 15 or so years. I like the chance for people to plug into our governance system, plug into citizenship and to political activity through a variety of doors, through a variety of channels and funnels. And the more of those, I think that the stronger, more dynamic our politics will be. But we still need majority rule. And ranked choice voting gives us a chance to have multiple parties, but a majority rule outcome. And that would, I think, be the sweet spot that would be, it would be energizing for our Minnesota politics. We have experiments going on in lots of places, Minneapolis, St. Paul, now Bloomington, St. Louis Park. And we have the state of Maine, which has done this, and New York City is about to have its Democratic mayoral primary with ranked choice voting. So the whole nation will see how that plays out. I know that within both of the traditional legacy political parties, there is resistance to ranked choice voting. So much so in the Republican Party that the Republican state senator, Mary Kiffmeyer, was trying to promote a bill that would outlaw ranked choice voting in Minnesota. That bill isn't going anywhere this year. Nevertheless, they're sending a signal that if Republicans were to take full control of state government in the 2022 election, ranked choice voting would be in trouble in this state. And that would be a shame, because this is, I think, an experiment with lots of promise. And as a resident of St. Paul, I can say it's served us pretty well. Would you say so, Dave?
I agree with you. The importance is certainly of ranked choice voting right now as a way. The way to bring some accountability. I wish I could point to some real successes, but it's still early. It's still early in the process.
Okay. Let's find another question here for us, Gretchen.
Yeah, so Julie Trude is the former mayor of Andover here, and she notes social media spreads good and bad information so fast now, and people don't seem to get past the headlines. Hasn't running for and holding office changed quite a bit because of this?
Yes. The answer is yes, it has changed, and not for the better. We have more ways for people to become informed than ever before, and yet I think in many ways our citizenry is less well informed than it was in the days of 3 television networks and everybody listening to CCO AM in the morning and reading the Star Tribune before they got to work that day. It's a different, it's a changed world. What I object to as a journalist is folks calling themselves journalists, but really being in some version of the entertainment business, which is to say they're using the tools of entertainment, playing on people's emotions to the anger, outrage, a tribal loyalty kind of thing, to build, they use those sorts of tools to build an audience to deliver to advertisers, as opposed to trying to serve the whole community in one geographic location, which was the business model of the legacy newspaper I worked for many years, trying to serve the whole community and then deliver the whole community's support to an advertiser. It's a different business model. It's one that's not helping us, in the social media business model is much more like that of Fox News than it is like the Star Tribune. So again, this is something that we have to just learn to live with as a society. I don't know a remedy. I don't know if Dave, if you know a remedy, but these things are all still kind of in their infancy. And if we're going to have a democracy, we're going to have to figure out how to make this work with democracy. I don't think we're there yet. What do you think, Dave?
Well, I agree with everything you said. I mean, you gave us a very important insight into it. And it's my favorite reporter, of course, is Jane McClure. And my favorite newspaper is the one that she works for, only because
folks up in the northern suburbs don't know who you're talking about, so say a little bit about who that is.
Yeah, excuse me?
You say a little bit about who that is. Our audience doesn't know Jane McClure.
Oh, Jane McClure and the
what Villager. And the Villager, yes, our local newspaper here in the east side and the west side of St. Paul, yes.
Yeah, right. The Mischke family, and but she is just She is just, you can't get her to speak. I've thought of opportunities where I'd like to put her in front of a bunch of people. She doesn't do it. She doesn't do that. But gosh, does she love to be in the room, listening and writing and reporting. God, it's fantastic.
You know that song from the Hamilton show about the room where it happens? Well, Jane McClure is in the room where it happens every time in St. Paul. And it makes for an accountability toward local government that we really need. It's so sad to see local newspapers dying in so many places, including greater Minnesota. We see in St. Paul how important that Villager newspaper, our little local paper is. Yeah.
I will say something here because I think that, League has worked quite a bit on civic education and hoping, trying to ensure that students know how government works and understand how government works. But it's just as important for us to understand how journalism works, good journalism. And people don't know the difference. They think that those entertainment shows are watching the news. And that's not, unless you have some way to sift out somebody that's just trying to get you hooked as opposed to somebody that's going to give you the straight line.
No, it's teaching media consumption, media, I've been using the wrong word here, but teaching people how to use the media appropriately to advance good citizenship ought to be part of civics education, I think.
Yeah, well, probably.
A couple years ago, I found a civics teacher at Southwest High School in Minneapolis. I just asked around, and finally somebody said, well, you need to speak to so-and-so, the civics teacher at Southwest. And she described for me how she taught civics, but it started at the very beginning of the year. They started by understanding what we're talking about now. They picked, and I remember we're talking about the Philando Castile case, because at the time that she had the students start with that case and look at that and examine it. How was it reported here? How was it reported there? Was this reported? Was that reported? She made them do that, and then she took them into the rest of the class and then talked about the substance of government and things like that. And at the end of listening to that explanation and meeting this person, I said, how many of you are there in the Minneapolis system? And she said, 0. I'm the only one. And maybe there's more in the suburbs, but that's her way. And boy, I love the way she.
Yeah. The League of Women Voters, I think, has been involved with State Representative Dean Erdahl, a Republican from Grove City, in trying to beef up civics education requirements for graduation in high school. That's a worthy effort. Keep up the good work there. That there's more to be done there.
Lots more. Here's a question for Senator Durenberger. And I don't know if you can see that there, Laurie. Having worked to elect Durenberger and Boschwitz as senators in '78 as a college Republican at St. Cloud State, I was a George Bush liberal Republican supporter in '80, but by '88, I found his conservatism intolerable and was a Dukakis voter. Did you feel that same shift, Senator, running for re-election in '88? Although to be fair, you seemed far left of Boschwitz then and in the Wellstone election.
Yes, I'm left of Rudy. But Rudy at 90 is going to live to be 100, and he's going to be raising money for the Republican Senate Committee in Minnesota. To that, and that's his thing, and God bless him for his conviction. And that is the kind of thing that he will be doing. But that year was that 1988 was a year in which the focus did begin to shift. I mean, where it was quite visible, and there was and again, when I say that, it was really that the conservatives became more saw greater opportunity, even though in the Senate there was a Democrat leader, as I've talked about before. They saw greater opportunities. And it isn't that they changed what they did as much as it was they changed how they talked about issues, whether you could get them on your bill or not. And so, but it was a gradual process from that time on.
You know, one of the things we often talk about in these book talks, and we didn't much dwell on today, was what was the Dave Durenberger winning coalition in Minnesota in 1978. And it's a marker of how close in policy the Republican Party that Dave came from in 1978 was to the DFL party of 1978. That after the very contentious DFL primary that year, in which Bob Short squeaks by Don Fraser by just a small amount on the strength of opposing Fraser on the Boundary Waters canoe area, motorized boat issue, and also on guns and abortion. A lot of folks in Minneapolis, especially, and I think in the Kenwood neighborhood, woke up the day after the primary not happy with the results of seeing that Bob Short had beat Don Fraser, and said to each other, let's look at this guy Durenberger, see if we can vote for him. And they looked at him and concluded that they could. They found him an acceptable choice over Bob Short, who was a very conservative DFLer. That coalition, Senator, stayed with you in some respects through every subsequent election that you had in 82 and in 88. So you wound up having a rather different coalition of support than Rudy Boschwitz, I think, ever had.
Yeah, I'll just say one other thing that occurs as I listen to what you're saying about that period of time, because 88 was a tough election. Guess who I'm up against?
Skip Humphrey.
Yeah, Skip Humphrey. Yeah. And I distinctly remember a conversation with the managing editor at the time of the Tribune about how much publicity I was going to be able to get during that period of time when, running against the Attorney General of the state, who was right there making news all the time. And it didn't sound like much. But I think the point was that the basic point to make, I think, is that the Tribune in particular, because it's pretty much the state newspaper, was not as staffed in Washington or as focused on Washington as it is today. And it's pretty clear that, Amy gets a lot of coverage. I think Tina should get more than she gets, but I'm not in the business. But all I'm saying is that newspaper has really changed over time in how it brings the news of Washington, how well it brings the news of Washington to you, and that's another factor that is reality of the past.
Yeah, but there has been a nationalization of all of our politics.
Yes,
that's not just about one newspaper's coverage. It's the whole phenomena. We are much less willing to have a state party, either Republican or Democrat, go a separate way from the national party. And again, back to campaign finance for the explanation.
Yeah, and to make your point, reinforce your point, that I've become a good friend of Tim McGuire's, who used to basically be the newspaper.
My old boss, yes.
Yeah, your old boss. And, when he talks about the research that's done at that newspaper, importantly, because it's a business, and it has to be run like a business. The research that tells them that there is a point in time when the value of that, whether it's the perceived value or whatever it is, but the ability to make enough of a profit so you can continue to run a newspaper like that at the rate that it's run today is going to go down. It's just the reality of what Laurie has been saying about the media in general, that it's going to be really hard even to hang on to the Tribune.
Scary thought. Who's got another question for us, Gretchen?
Well, so I had said, legislators focus on the next election. Our term limits the answer. And former Representative Kathy Tingelstad answered, term limits would certainly help to improve the current situation. How do you guys feel about that?
I hate to disagree with Kathy Tingelstad and Gretchen Sable, both of whom I admire so much, but I have never been a fan of term limits. My experience always was that the more senior legislators had the knowledge and the independence to really represent their districts as they saw fit, rather than to have to toe the caucus's line or to be much under the sway of staffers or more likely lobbyists. I think to keep maximizing it in our legislature, the institutional knowledge that the legislators themselves have, well, they just they became better legislators. The other comment I would make about our Minnesota politics is that we don't have a problem with long-serving legislators in Minnesota. We've had a few, yes. Phyllis Kahn was there for 44 years, and I think Lyndon Carlson one term longer than she was there. But that they are really exceptions. The average stay in the Minnesota House, there was a study done some years ago, is less than 8 years. I would argue that we could actually stand for some more institutional memory in that body. The average tenure in the state Senate used to be much longer. It's not anymore. We have one long-serving Congress member now, and that's Betty McCollum. Everybody else is just in their second or third term at most. So we don't really have a problem with long-serving legislators. I think if we had term limits, we would have a problem with further empowering the unelected folks, the lobbyists and staffers.
Well, thanks.
Can I add just one comment to that, which is the reason I oppose it is I love these independents. You know, the two guys up on the range and so forth. You know, I hope they stay like forever, because they're the only people that, you know, make some sense and give you some hope for the future, that maybe more people will join them. I don't know how Erdahl, for example, sticks it out there, because, you know, if it doesn't get through Kurt Dowd and the Republican, you know, so it's got to be really frustrating for everybody else. But it's sort of like the independents. Maybe if we could get more people to become that, it would be helpful.
There was a proposal, came from some Republicans actually, a few years ago, to experiment with going back to a nonpartisan legislature. The old timers I would talk to always said that that's sort of where did Minnesota's legislature begin to go wrong? And Dave, you and I have some of this in the book, in the go wrong in the minds of some of the old timers who thought we had a better legislature in the 1960s and 70s. They would point to annual sessions. Going from biennial to annual sessions made it more difficult to recruit talented candidates. And they would point to the switch away from the nonpartisan legislature to a partisan one, that we saw in the years soon after that change, quite a ramp up in partisan hostilities, especially in the Minnesota House, and that persists to this day.
I just add one thing to that, to this whole discussion we're having, and that is, the problem still starts at the local level. It starts with human beings. It starts with the voter. You know, that's really the problem today. You know, ask any one of our people that we know who are the mayors, that, you know, where the problem lies. It lies with the person that puts on his red hat or his blue hat and will never take it off. You know, that sort of thing. And this is what, and we're going to have to do the same thing in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I mean, it's really very, very difficult to get through the existing, quote, system of representation unless the voters themselves decide that, and where they get their leadership, it comes from people like the League of Women Voters, I think. Yeah, it's something you just have to dedicate yourselves to.
Well, that's right. And folks need to be educated about the need to participate, not just on election day or in the run up to the election, but during the whole cycle.
Yeah, go to those council meetings. That's right.
Yeah,
go to those
that's right. And get involved in party building. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you guys. There have been all kinds of thank yous coming up in the chat. So we'll say thanks now, since we're right at the hour mark. We do have a question on redistricting just popped in. Do you have time to do one more?
If we keep it kind of quick, sure.
Do you think redistricting that pits more areas with swing seats would improve things?
I like competitive politics. I'm a
Okay.
journalist. Of course, I like competitive politics. So yes, I actually do think the more competitive districts, the better. But I also know that in Minnesota, the courts have been doing our redistricting pretty much every time, with the exception of 1991 when Arnie Carlson botched a veto. The courts have done our redistricting since every year since 1970, and it's going to happen again this year because we have this propensity for divided government. Redistricting will be done by the courts. They don't typically look for competitiveness as one of their criteria. And yet, I don't know how you get a competitive district, a desire for competitive districts out of a one-party legislature either. I think we're actually in good hands with the courts. The ultimate solution is independent commission, which is what California and Iowa and several other states have done. We've had that proposal. The legislature won't put it on the ballot. I feel like if it ever got to the ballot, it would pass like that.
Thank you all very